Greetings to all of you. We have arrived at the end of the course, at the end of the class, and I will not spend so much time today to talk about Dostoevsky, although I will say a few things. But rather, I like to go with all of you. I will go together from the beginning to the end, only from looking at the problem or at the perspective, and that is whether we as human beings can be considered as individuals or persons. And if it's fine with you, let's travel together from the beginning, from Plato, how we discussed it before the beginning of the semester, and we will end with Dostoevsky. So, if you remember the Greeks, for the Greeks before Plato especially, they seem to have been interested in emotions, in how human beings interact whenever they have various stimuli from the outside. So they were not preoccupied so much with the soul body distinction, and they were not preoccupied so much either with what makes a human being what he is, the way in which we discussed Aristotle later. For so the Greeks before Plato were much more concerned with those forces that they perceived that come upon human beings and how we, each one of us individually, react to those human beings. Later in Plato, the preoccupation is with the good life, and especially forgive me, with Socrates. If you remember, he is very much interested in what makes the life of a human being good. This is why we talked about education, because education has to do with the soul for Plato and for Socrates, and having to do with the soul, it may influence the way in which a human being lives his or her own life. It is perhaps for the first time that we also find the idea of the responsibility for the other that we so much discussed when we arrived to Dostoevsky. Socrates, if you remember, feels that he is a gift for the Athenians, and his duty is to tell them that which is true, or his duty is to cleanse their souls. He perceives it, or his duty may be to help them give birth to the good they have inside. But this is for the first time. Well, maybe not for the first time, but it's one of the first times in which we find the idea of the responsibility of someone for the good of another, and which can be extrapolated that it could be the responsibility that one has for the good of the whole world. After we leave Plato and we arrive in Aristotle, we no longer find the interest in persons. In Plato, it was much more personal good, especially because it was not at the beginning, the dialogues we read. It was not about what makes a human being good in the same way in which we can talk about what makes a knife good, what makes a knife a good knife, but rather about how a human soul is cleansed of its impurities and achieves goodness and knowledge. For Aristotle, who is, I think, the champion of individuals, although we do talk about individuals, he is probably very little concerned with persons and with the personhood of someone. He is much more interested in what makes a living being the kind of thing that he is or that it is. You may remember that we discussed that he is not interested in what makes Tavi Tavi, so what makes me me, what kind of features I have that makes me the little human being I am with the interactions I have with other people, but rather what makes me the kind of thing that I am, so what makes me a human being, or he's not interested in a cat, in Mishu, what makes Mishu Mishu, but rather what makes Mishu a cat. A much more scientific approach, and because of that, we can also say that it's not so much of an interest in personhood or in persons, but rather in individuals of a kind. When we move to Gregory of Nyssa, we change the Aristotelian approach to something much closer to a Platonic approach, because Gregory of Nyssa is concerned with personal salvation. Obviously, there is a huge difference between Gregory of Nyssa and Plato, and that is mainly because Plato looks very much to the world that's happening after our death, and everything here on this earth, it's just a mere copy of the forms in heaven. Well, this is the general view on Plato. Obviously, there could be many more detailed ways in which we can analyze what he says. But Gregory of Nyssa, for Gregory of Nyssa, salvation begins here on this earth because it is a renewal of creations. In any case, even for him, the interest is in persons because the salvation is personal. It is me, a human being with my details, that can be saved or not because it is my soul that is going to be cleansed. That doesn't necessarily have a connection with how I define myself as a member of my species, as we had it in Aristotle before. We move to Dostoevsky. Whew, I think I love Dostoevsky, as you may have realized by now. Here, personhood is probably the main issue, and what makes how a person is considered. I do not know whether there is any other book that discusses the details of a human soul so deeply and so wonderfully at the same time, because Dostoevsky can see in the depth of human beings of all kinds. Even that is probably mistaken to say human beings of all kinds, because I separate humans in kinds. But of of the passions that can really ravish a human soul. Here we no longer speak of individuals, but rather of persons. In this case, why? And you have this on the PowerPoint. Individuals are always replaceable. If I talk about individual, I can replace an individual with someone else of its kind. If I do not no longer like my cat, but I still want to have a cat, it doesn't matter whether I have a relationship with Mishu, because I can copy the relationship I have with Mishu by replacing Mishu with another cat. Or if I just consider any kind of human being an individual, it does no longer matter how I rely to that person, to that individual personally, because I can replace the individual with another one that can perform the function that I wanted from that individual. So in a workplace, human beings are not persons usually, but rather individuals, unfortunately. I'm not saying that the workplace can function if you have individuals, if you have persons. I don't want to talk about that actually. I don't want to have any kind of comment on that. But in principle, if you think about the workplace, you have an institution in which every human being functions according to what he or she has as a job. If that person no longer functions well, the employer replaces him or her with someone else. In relationships, so whenever we have personal relationships, persons are never replaceable. They are irreplaceable, because I can never replace the relationship I have with my wife or with my son or with my parents with someone else. If I have another son, or if I have another parent or another wife or something like that, it's a new relationship, completely a new relationship. I cannot say I replace you with someone else. There's a song actually, I just heard it on the radio. Horrible song that says something that you should not think that you're irreplaceable. Well, anyway, doesn't matter. So this is a feature that we all have according to Dostoevsky, not in a Aristotelian sense, so not because it makes us members of a certain group, but rather because all of us, being persons, are completely irreplaceable because we are unique. Nothing but unique. Um, so, if we are unique, there is the possibility of taking every individual in the world to our hearts. There is a wonderful, I do not know what I want to say, there is a wonderful line at the end. I take you all to my heart, and I ask you all to take me to yours. Alyosha says that. Who could say that in the book other than Alyosha? Why? Because we all remain in each other's hearts when we interacted in this life. Um, Dostoevsky, I think, is very aware of the fact that everyone we encounter in life remains with us. And everyone that we encounter in life has been with us and will be with us afterwards. Because somehow it forms our souls. In our interactions we had on the forums, and maybe even in these videos, and the way in which you communicate with each other on the forums, somehow you touch one another, more or less, because I know that sometimes, you could just write comments because you have to do them, otherwise because you are really into them and so on, depending on how life is and how strong the interest would be in those things that we read. But we touch on one another, and this is this influence that we have on other people brings on us for Dostoevsky a huge responsibility. A huge responsibility because he acknowledges that somehow we are creators of the world in which we live. We complain so much about our environments. We complain so much about the how the world is, how the people around us are, but we often forget that we are part of it. That the world that we criticize is never outside of us, but it is part of us, and we are part of it. I know the first thing that I said, that the world is part of us, may be strange, but it is in a sense. The world is part of us. It makes us who we are. I like to direct you towards the final pages. I will not comment on the trial at all. I encourage you to read it. It's fabulous, really, as everything in the Karamazov brothers is. But here at the end, sorry for moving all the time here. Here at the end, you have Alyosha saying something towards the boys. I will not tell you. Well, it's Ilyushka funeral, so you would know that he died. The little boy died. Ilyushechka funeral. He said something like this. Page 973, if you're following with me. But still, no matter how wicked we become, which God grant we may never be, but we all know that we can become wicked, I would say, when we recall how we buried Alyosha, how we loved him in these last days, and how we talked together by this stone with such closeness and affection, then even the cruelest and most cynical among us, if such there be, will not dare to mock the kindness and goodness of this moment. Moreover, that memory alone perhaps will restrain that person for some great wickedness, and he will think about it and will say, "Yes, I was good then, I was brave and honorable." You remember how Alyosha was telling Ivan, "Remember me before you do anything wrong," because if you remember you remember the goodness, remember the relationship have with another human being, and really in the relationship there is always something else there. It is the relationship itself, the love that is created between two human beings. Then perhaps that love and that beauty can help me not do the wicked things that I may want to do. So he may still ridicule it inwardly. That doesn't matter. People often make fun. That doesn't matter. People often make fun of what is kind and good. That's only frivolity. But I assure you, boys, that even as he mocks, he will immediately say in his heart, "No, I was wrong to mock, because one should not make fun of that." You have written on the forums about how Mitya's life may be influenced by the way in which she grew up. And we also know about Alyosha, how he remembers the angelic face of his mother, and how that image, that icon, somehow remained his whole life in his soul. And maybe it's the reason why he is such a kind of spirit. But this also, you can see here that Dostoevsky really focuses on that. What we experience in life touches us. What we experience in our youth touches us. And we are so responsible for the life of our children and for the life of the young people around us, because the way in which we behave with them, we create the world in which they will live. It's quite, I mean, forgive me, I'm not trying to say that we are all responsible for that in a bad way. Remember what I said last time. Responsibility does not come with accusation. Responsibility with accusation is nothing, it's just evil. Responsibility comes with love. So, do not think ever about the darkness of responsibility, but rather the lightness of responsibility, the light, the goodness that comes from responsibility. But really, if you think about it, we, those people who complain about how the world becomes, and we, those people who complain about how the world is, we are the ones who create it. We are the ones, and I think I'm speaking truly if I refer to Dostoevsky, but we are the ones who are influencing the way in which things are. So, eternal remembrance, what they say here about the dead boy, the dead Ilyushechka, is maintaining another human soul with us, being aware of it. Um, Ilyushechka is alive in their group. And Ilyushechka is alive because she remains with them. Ilyushechka dies, so Ilyusha, the little boy, if I say Ilyushechka or Ilyusha, is the little boy who dies, not Alyosha. Okay, so he dies truly and for good only when these boys completely forget him. That's why we need eternal remembrance. He dies only when the goodness that his little life occasioned is completely lost in the life of the others. So, for Dostoevsky, what soul is really a responsible soul, and that is also a loving soul. A soul that cares and that acknowledges the beauty that is around it and acknowledges that it can also influence the beauty that is around it. And it is responsible for it. And it's responsible for how that beauty can go to ruin, and is responsible for how that beauty can continue. Um, well, really, Dostoevsky, I think, is influenced by what Gregory Nyssa says. Man is mad whom God has commanded to become God. So, but how do you become a God? Well, a God according to grace, as some people may say, or not a God by essence, but rather acting in a godly way as Alyosha does. Well, if you think of Alyosha, it's by embracing everyone, not because everyone, not to love the wicked, of course. It's not. That's not about that, but rather about to love about that which the other one can be, and the other one can always be a beautiful human being. Thank you very much for this semester. I hope you are all well, and I wish you to have a good life.